The sunlight filtered to the half-closed blinds, casting soft patterns across the worn oak table that had seen decades of meals, conversations, and silences. It was a quiet afternoon in the Green household. At least it had been, until the tension began to mount. Walter Green, a retired engineer of 68, sat at the head of the table with his back straight and hands resting lightly on either side of his plate. His thinning silver hair and thoughtful gray eyes gave him the quiet presence of a man used to solving problems, not causing them. To his left sat his son, Connor, 34 years old, balding early and growing heavier around the middle. On Walter's right was Megan, Connor's wife of 5 years, polite and reserved, her hands always folding napkins, even when there was nothing to fold. Lunch had been simple: a tuna casserole, some steamed broccoli, and a jug of iced tea with lemon slices floating on top. Walter had cooked it, as usual. It was what he did. He made the meals, kept the lawn trimmed, and drove himself to the pharmacy when he needed to. Connor had once joked that the house still ran because Walter ran it. But that had been long ago, when jokes still came from a place of warmth. Today, silence hovered thick over the casserole. Megan offered mild compliments about the food, but Connor only pushed the broccoli around his plate. The conversation, if it could be called that, limped along for several minutes. Megan brought up her sister's baby shower. Walter nodded, responding briefly, always polite, always measured. Then Connor sighed, deep and loud, setting his fork down with a clatter that startled even himself. "God, this is depressing," he said, shaking his head. "Every lunch is like eating in a morgue." Walter looked up, blinking once, then returned his gaze to his plate. Megan shifted in her seat, but said nothing. Connor wasn't finished. "Do you even do anything all day, Dad, besides hover around this house and cook like some sad cafeteria lady? I mean, seriously, what's the point? You're just a useless old man sitting here like a piece of furniture." The words landed like a hammer. The room didn't fall silent because it already was. It simply froze. Megan looked at Connor, her mouth slightly open, but she still said nothing. Walter, fork halfway at his mouth, paused, then gently set it down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even meet his son's eyes. Instead, he smiled, not out of joy or sarcasm, but something quieter and deeper, a smile of resignation, a smile that said he had heard worse, felt worse, but would not break. "Would anyone like more tea?" Walter asked, voice steady. No one answered. Megan lowered her eyes. Connor, perhaps sensing the weight of what it said, or simply irritated by the lack of reaction, stood up abruptly, muttered something about being late, and left the kitchen. The door to the garage slammed. Megan followed a few minutes later, her excuses trailing like smoke. "I'll talk to him. He's just stressed. Work has been hard." Walter nodded through it all. He finished his plate in silence, cleared the table, and washed the dishes. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. But something shifted inside him, something tectonic and irreversible. A lifetime of quiet contributions, of sacrifices made without complaint, had all been distilled into those 4 words. Useless old man. Spoken not by a stranger, but by the son he had raised, protected, educated, and housed. When the kitchen was clean, Walter sat by the window in the living room and watched the wind ripple through the tall oaks that lined the backyard. He thought of the years he had spent patching the roof, fixing the plumbing, and paying bills without ever asking for help. He remembered holding Connor's hand as they walked into the elementary school for the first time, staying up late to help with science projects, covering the tuition bills that scholarships didn't. He had never asked for gratitude, but this casual cruelty was not something he could ignore. Not anymore. The afternoon faded into evening. The house settled into silence again. Connor and Megan returned, exchanged shallow pleasantries, and went upstairs. Walter went to his room, but he didn't sleep. Not fully. He sat in the chair by his desk, looking at old blueprints he had kept from his working days, lines and angles that had once built bridges, warehouses, and community centers. They reminded him of a time when he had built things that lasted. At some point in the early morning, with the neighborhood still dark and quiet, Walter made a phone call. His voice was calm, precise. "Yes, I like to schedule a full lock replacement. Every door. Today, if possible. He hung up, then opened his window and breathed in the cool dawn air. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and distant rain. For the first time in years, he didn't feel passive. He felt deliberate. The wheels had begun to turn. He didn't know exactly what would come next, but one thing was certain. He would no longer accept being a background figure in his own home. Whatever happened from here on out would be on his terms. Quietly, respectfully, but unmistakably his. The locksmith arrived promptly at 8 o'clock in the morning. Walter greeted him with a nod, directing him to the front door first. The man was young, efficient, and didn't ask many questions, just confirmed the scope of work and got started. As the drill hummed and the screws came out, Walter stood a few feet away, watching quietly, arms folded. There was no anger in his posture, no tension in his shoulders, only clarity. Every turn of the screwdriver felt like a step taken back towards something Walter hadn't felt in years, control. While the locksmith worked, Walter took a slow walk to the house, not out of habit, but to mark the space again. It had once been his sanctuary, a place filled with warmth and a sense of belonging. But over time, his presence had been reduced to a utility. He cooked, he maintained, he stayed out of the way. No one had said it out loud, but the message had been clear for years. This was Connor's house now, at least in attitude, if not on paper. But the paper mattered. The house was in Walter's name. He had paid for it, maintained it, and kept it running. When Connor lost his job 2 years ago, it was Walter who quietly absorbed the bills without complaint. And when Megan suggested they all live together temporarily, Walter didn't hesitate. He had always been the man who gave without conditions. By mid-morning, every lock had been replaced. Front door, back door, garage access. Even the sliding glass door that led to the patio now had a new latch with a reinforced deadbolt. Walter walked the perimeter with the locksmith one last time, paid him in cash, and thanked him with a firm handshake. Once the man left, Walter stood at the threshold of his home and shut the new door slowly, listening to the satisfying click of the bolt sliding into place. It wasn't just a new lock. It was a line drawn, not out of malice, but necessity. He returned to the kitchen and brewed himself a fresh pot of coffee, setting the table for one. There was no rush, no need to accommodate anyone else's schedule. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the air in the house felt different, less tense, less haunted. For the first time in recent memory, Walter wasn't walking on eggshells. Around noon, he pulled a chair onto the back patio and sat with his coffee, watching the leaves stir in the breeze. He thought of nothing and everything at once. He remembered how Connor used to help him rake those leaves as a child, laughing and tumbling into the piles. That boy, the one with grass-stained jeans and boundless questions, felt like a ghost now, a warm memory calcified by years of resentment. Walter didn't dwell on it long. He knew memory could be both a comfort and a chain. Today wasn't about looking backward. It was about deciding, quietly and finally, how he would spend the years he had left. By early afternoon, he made a few calls. Nothing dramatic, just a reservation at the hardware store for some basic supplies, and a message to a neighbor who owed him a lunch. He felt a strange kind of momentum, one not fueled by spite, but by long-neglected self-respect. That evening, Connor returned. The sound of the key failing in the lock echoed in the hallway, a moment of confusion, followed by the sharp rattle of the doorknob. Then knocking, then pounding. "Dad!" Connor's voice was thick with disbelief. "What the hell?" Walter approached the door calmly, coffee mug in hand. He opened it halfway, enough to meet his son's eyes, but not to invite him in. "What's going on?" "My key's not working," Connor said, jaw tightening. "I had the locks changed," Walter replied, voice even. Connor blinked. "You did what?" "I had the locks changed," Walter repeated, unmoved. "This house is mine. I made a decision. You can't just... What, kick us out? Are you serious?" Walter didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch between them like a drawn curtain. Finally, he said, "I'm not kicking anyone out. I'm making it clear that things won't continue the way they have. If you want to live here, it has to be on different terms." Connor's face shifted from shock to anger. So this is about yesterday? I said something I shouldn't have, fine, but you don't get to... This isn't just about yesterday. Walter cut in, not raising his voice but narrowing his tone. It's about years. It's about how this house became a place where I'm tolerated, not respected. Connor stepped back slightly, chest heaving. You're overreacting. You're being ridiculous. Perhaps, Walter said, but I'm also being clear. He closed the door slowly, not slamming it, just firm enough to make his point. There were no dramatic shouts or threats, no screaming matches, only the quiet finality of a man who had decided not to be invisible anymore. Upstairs, the room Connor and Megan had shared remained untouched. Walter didn't pack their things or throw anything out. He wasn't making a spectacle. He was simply reclaiming what had always been his. Later that night, the house was quiet again. Walter stood at the kitchen sink, washing a single coffee cup. The weight in his chest had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it no longer pressed him down. It reminded him he was alive, making choices, shaping his own days. He didn't look at the phone. He didn't wait for a call or a knock or an apology. Whatever came next would come. But tonight, he would sleep under his own roof, behind locks he chose, on terms he set. And for the first time in a very long time, he would sleep soundly. The following afternoon arrived with a heavy sky and a sticky breeze, the kind that hinted at late summer thunderstorms. Walter spent the early hours of the day in his garage, rearranging tools that hadn't been touched in months. The space smelled of oil and sawdust, and he moved through it with purpose, rediscovering long-forgotten screwdrivers and precision wrenches. By the time the clock hit 5 o'clock in the evening, he had reorganized 3 drawers and repaired the broken leg of a wooden stool. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its usual rhythm. Children returning home from soccer practice, sprinklers hissing against manicured lawns, the distant hum of a lawnmower on the next block. Walter stood on the porch for a moment, letting the scent of rain mix with the hum of the world. Then the engine noise came. Connor's car, an old black sedan that rattled more than it roared, pulled up into the driveway with a sharp jerk. Walter stepped back inside, not out of fear, but because he didn't need a performance. He waited just inside the front hallway, the new deadbolt already locked. A moment later, he heard it, the quick, familiar jingle of keys followed by the failed turn in the lock. Then came the knock. Then came the pounding. "Dad, open the door." Walter remained still. He waited until the knocking stopped, then unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open just enough to see his son's flushed face. Megan sat in the passenger seat of the car behind him, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Are you really doing this again?" Connor barked, voice already pitched with frustration. "I had to crash on a friend's couch last night. You're really going to keep this up?" Walter's voice was calm. "I told you, things have changed. You didn't tell me anything. You locked me out like a damn squatter. This is my home, too." Walter raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Is it?" Connor hesitated, and his hands balled into fists. "Yes, I've lived here for years. I helped fix this place up." "No," Walter interrupted. "You stayed here. You didn't fix anything. You didn't pay the taxes. You didn't maintain the pipes. You lived here because I allowed it." "That's not fair," Connor muttered, but the fire in his voice was cooling. He shifted his stance, like a boxer realizing he was outmatched. "I'm not trying to hurt you," Walter said, "but I will not live like a ghost in my own home anymore." Connor looked past him, perhaps hoping to catch a glimpse of something familiar inside. "So that's it? You're just going to kick us out without even talking about it?" "We're talking now." Connor shook his head. "This is insane. I could call someone. A lawyer." Walter didn't flinch. "You can call whoever you want. The deed is in my name. You are not a tenant. You have no lease. You're my son, and that used to mean something more than free rent and cold shoulders." That landed. Connor blinked, then looked away, jaw clenched. Behind him, Megan stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway. Her approach was quieter, more deliberate. "Walter," she said gently, "I understand you're angry, but we can talk through this. We don't have to make it ugly." Walter looked at her, You're not the problem. She nodded. I know, but I'm part of the silence. And that was my mistake. Connor scowled. You're taking a side? I'm not taking sides, she said, not looking at him. I'm seeing clearly for the first time in a while. Walter stepped back slightly, but didn't open the door any wider. You can come in, Megan. Just you. Connor looked stunned. You've got to be kidding me. No, Walter said firmly. You can wait in the car. For a moment, Connor looked like he might argue, but something in his father's voice, something unwavering, told him not to. He turned sharply and stormed back to the car, slamming the door hard enough to make the glass rattle. Megan entered quietly. Walter led her to the kitchen, where 2 cups of tea were already waiting. He had prepared them ahead of time, not because he expected a guest, but because some part of him knew this day would come. They sat in silence for a few moments. The tea steamed gently between them. I should have said something that day, Megan began. At lunch, when he said what he said. I didn't speak up, and I should have. You didn't deserve that. Walter nodded slowly. No, I didn't. But I also didn't expect you to fix him. That's not your job. I've been watching this happen for a while now, she said. The resentment, the bitterness. It's been eating at him ever since he lost his job. He doesn't know who he is anymore. And I didn't know how to help without losing myself in the process. Walter sipped his tea. He needs to find who he is without using me as a punching bag. They sat for a long while, the silence no longer heavy but thoughtful. The sound of rain finally came, a soft tapping on the windows, as if the house itself was exhaling after a long breath. I don't know what's next, Megan admitted. We'll stay at my sister's place for now. But I don't want this to be permanent. Walter nodded again. That depends on him. Megan rose to leave. At the door, she turned. Thank you for letting me in. You're welcome anytime, he said, as long as you knock. She smiled faintly, then disappeared into the storm. Walter watched her leave, then locked the door once more, standing there for a while in the quiet. He didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a win, but it was the beginning of something else, a new kind of order, one where his voice would be heard, his space respected, and his life no longer lived in the background of someone else's struggle. Night fell in measured silence, not like the stormy one before, but with a softness that seemed to coat every object in the house with stillness. Walter closed the curtains in the living room slowly, hands steady, movements deliberate. The house no longer echoed with distant footsteps or the opening and closing of bedroom doors that weren't his. There were no murmured conversations behind walls, no television flickering upstairs, no midnight snack wrappers crackling in the kitchen, just the sound of a home returning to itself. He stood for a long time in the quiet. Then, after washing his mug and placing it carefully on the drying rack, he turned to the hallway and took a long breath before climbing the stairs. His knees protested slightly, but he made the ascent without pause. At the top of the landing, the room stretched out like chambers of a forgotten life. He didn't go into Connor and Megan's room, not out of anger, just disinterest. That chapter had shifted. Instead, Walter entered his own room, took off his shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't turn on the television or check his phone. He reached for the small lamp on the nightstand and clicked it off, allowing the moonlight to wash through the window. The silence was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. It was a kind of quiet that invited thought, not the haunted kind, but the honest, uncluttered variety. He lay back and closed his eyes. He slept, and when he woke up, it was because of birdsong, not door slamming or an alarm on someone else's phone. The sunlight crept through the curtains, and for a moment he simply lay there, feeling the weight of the bed sheets, the softness of the pillow beneath his neck. He couldn't remember the last time he had woken up without the mental checklist of someone else's needs dictating the rhythm of his day. By 7 o'clock in the morning, Walter was dressed and in the kitchen. He cracked 2 eggs into a pan and sliced a tomato with the same paring knife he'd had for over 20 years. The smell of breakfast filled the air. When he sat down at the table, his table, there were no side comments, no interruptions, no hurried glances at phones. After eating, he did something unexpected. He began organizing, not just a simple dusting or a clearing of clutter, but an intentional sorting of what mattered and what didn't. It started in the basement, where boxes of old tools and forgotten holiday decorations sat gathering dust. He pulled them out one by one, opening lids, tossing out broken lights and melted candles. He found a box labeled Connor, College, and paused. Inside were notebooks, a few awards, and a letter from Professor praising his early engineering concepts. Walter placed it aside not with bitterness, but with a faint sense of loss, of potential untended. Then he moved to the upstairs hallway closet. Out went the unused coats, the rusted umbrella stands, the board games missing too many pieces. He cleared space not to replace it with more, but simply to reclaim the openness. There was something about breathing room that he hadn't known he missed. By mid-afternoon, he stood in the living room with a trash bag in one hand and a cordless vacuum in the other. He hadn't planned on this level of deep cleaning, but it felt right. With each sweep of the floor and each cleared corner, a sense of clarity followed. He was not just cleaning a house. He was making room for himself again. When he finally sat down on the couch, freshly showered and satisfied, the doorbell rang. For a second, his body tensed instinctively, a remnant of the past few days. But then he stood and walked to the door with measured calm. It wasn't Connor. It was Henry. Old Henry, from 3 houses down. Retired firefighter. Thick gray mustache, denim overalls, and the same bald cap he'd worn every day since Walter had known him. They hadn't spoken in months, maybe longer. But here he was, holding a folded newspaper and smiling. "Got your paper by mistake," Henry said, lifting it. Walter took it with a chuckle. "Thanks. I didn't even notice it was missing." Henry looked past him into the house. "Place looks different. Air feels lighter." Walter smiled faintly, making some changes. "You finally kicked the boy out, huh?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He stepped back and gestured toward the living room. "Come in. I just made coffee." Henry didn't hesitate. Within minutes, they were sitting across from each other, the scent of fresh brew drifting between them. "You know," Henry began, stirring sugar into his cup, "when my oldest moved back home after his divorce, I told my wife he'd be out in 6 months. Took 3 years. And every one of them chipped away at the walls in our marriage. Not because he was a bad man, but because he forgot how to live without leaning." Walter nodded. "Leaning becomes habit. For them and for us." Henry tapped his mug. "Glad to see you taking back the wheel." They talked for nearly an hour about neighborhood gossip, the city's new recycling policies, a local hardware store changing owners. It was the most Walter had laughed in weeks. And when Henry left, promising to invite Walter over for poker night again, something settled inside him, a quiet reassurance that life outside of parenting still existed. That evening, Walter found himself sitting on the patio, watching the last rays of sun bend over the fence. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and hesitated over one name, Michael, an old friend from work. They'd lost touch after retirement. Conversations replaced by the occasional forwarded email. Walter tapped the name. Called. The phone rang twice before a gruff but familiar voice answered. "Well, I'll be damned," Michael said. "You're alive." Walter laughed. "Barely. What's the occasion? I thought maybe we could catch up. Coffee? Something simple." There was a pause, and "I'd like that. Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow's good." Walter hung up and leaned back in his chair. The night was cool, the air clean, the patio lights dimmed to a soft amber. For the first time in what felt like decades, the hours were alone. No obligations. No obligations except the ones he chose. He didn't know where the days ahead would lead. But this first night apart, wasn't lonely. It was the first stone laid on a path he should have started walking long ago. It was just past 9 o'clock in the morning when Walter climbed up into the attic for the first time in years. The narrow staircase creaked under his weight, and a familiar scent of insulation and cardboard filled the air. Dust floated in the golden shaft of light that spilled to a small, round window near the roof's peak. For most of his life, this space had been storage, a forgotten vault of family artifacts, seasonal decorations, old furniture, and boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. Today, though it felt like a vault waiting to be unlocked. Walter didn't come up here with a plan. He had woken up with a strange urge to dig, not into the earth, but into the memories buried in this space. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something was up here, something that needed to be seen again. He moved slowly between the boxes, brushing off labels, peeking into cracked lids, feeling textures of fabric and aged paper. The attic was warmer than the rest of the house, but Walter barely noticed. In a corner beneath a low beam, he spotted a large plastic tub with a cracked lid and a faint label and faded marker. Photos, miscellaneous. He pulled it closer and opened it. Inside, a stack of photo albums, envelopes stuffed with loose prints, and old family frames lay in a quiet heap. Walter pulled one album onto his lap and opened the leather cover. The first page was a candid snapshot of Connor as a toddler, barefoot in the backyard, his tiny fists clenched around dandelions, smiling up at the camera. Walter's own shadow stretched across the grass in the photo, suggesting he had been the one taking it. He turned the pages slowly. Connor's first day of school. A camping trip where the tent collapsed in the rain. A science fair his project proudly displayed. A bridge made of popsicle sticks. Megan was there too, in the later photos. Weddings, barbecues, Christmas mornings. So many captured moments. So many expressions of joy that now felt impossibly distant. But it wasn't nostalgia that crept into Walter's chest. It was something sharper. These photos weren't just records of happy times. They were reminders of how deeply he had been invested in a life that now barely acknowledged him. Each image was a receipt for time, attention, sacrifice. He set the album down and reached for another box nearby, smaller and sturdier. Inside, he found a thick manila envelope labeled simply Connor, Drawings. Pulling it open, Walter slid out a dozen or so crayon sketches and pencil doodles from Connor's childhood. Handmade card with blocky letters reading "Best Dad Ever," or "Thank you for fixing my bike." One drawing in particular caught his eye. It was a crude rendition of a house, with three figures in front of it: a child, a mother, and a tall man with a square head and a big red tie. On the back, in Connor's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Me and Dad and Mom, safe at home." Walter held the drawing for a long time. How had that version of their relationship faded? When did Connor stop seeing him as protector and start seeing him as an inconvenience? There had been no moment he could pinpoint, just a long, slow unraveling. 100 small dismissals, 1,000 eye rolls, the gradual tightening of walls around a man who had only ever tried to keep them open. He stood and placed the envelope under his arm, then moved back toward the far wall, where an old wooden chest sat beneath a moth-eaten blanket. He opened it, revealing stacks of books, loose tools, and another photo album. This one older, heavier, covered in cracked black leather. Inside, it held pictures of Walter and his late wife, Carol. Their wedding day, their first apartment, a road trip through New England. Then came the years of young parenthood. Carol in the garden with a baby on her hip. Walter tinkering in the garage while a child played in the driveway. He hadn't opened this album since she passed, and the ache returned, not sharp but deep, like a river that had never quite dried. Walter sat down again and allowed himself to feel it. Not grief, exactly, but the vastness of everything that had changed. He was alone now, not just in the house, but in the architecture of his life. The roles he had played were stripped away, one by one. Husband, father, provider, even the role of reliable background presence had reached its end. Downstairs, the clock chimed the hour, noon. Walter closed the album, stood slowly, and descended the stairs with the envelope of drawings still under his arm. He placed it on the dining table and sat in the chair at the head, the same chair where just days ago he had been called useless. There was a clarity in him now, not the brittle kind born of anger, but a firm realization. He had built his life around service, around providing, fixing, supporting. And in doing so, he had slowly made himself invisible. The insult at the lunch table had not been a sudden storm. It had been the final gust after years of subtle weathering. But he was still here, still capable, still Walter Green. He stood, grabbed a pad of paper from the drawer by the fridge, and wrote a short list. Garage, Organize shelves. Call Michael coffee. Senior center. Look up events. Library volunteer form. Refinish patio table. It wasn't a to-do list in the ordinary sense. It was a declaration, a framework for the days ahead. Each line was something that belonged to him, his time, his space, his purpose. Later that afternoon, he left the house for a walk. Not to go anywhere in particular, just to move, to breathe outside air. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Children still played on sidewalks. Lawns were still trimmed with suburban precision. But Walter moved through it differently now. He wasn't a father trailing behind, waiting to be asked for something. He was simply a man walking through his world on his own terms. When he passed by the park, he noticed a flyer pinned to the community board. Volunteer Woodworking Group, seeking experienced hands. He tore off a tab with the contact number and slipped it into his pocket. That evening, he returned home just before dusk. The house greeted him with its stillness. And as he stood in the living room, looking toward the hallway that led to the spare room, he made another quiet decision. He would turn it into something new. Not a guest room, not storage. A space that was his alone, reading, music, maybe even sketching again. Not for anyone else, just for him. He didn't know if Connor would come back. He didn't know if their relationship would ever resemble what it once was. But for the first time in a long while, that wasn't the central question. The real question was no longer, what do they need from me? It was, what have I yet to build for myself? 2 days later, a letter from a law firm arrived in the mailbox. Walter found it nestled between a gardening catalog and a utility bill. The envelope was crisp, cream-colored, and formal, bearing a firm name he didn't recognize. His fingers hesitated for a second before opening it. He already knew what it was. Even before reading the first line, Connor had hired a lawyer. The language was cautious but pointed. Statement about long-term residency, reasonable notice, and assumed inheritance. The letter did not demand ownership or file an official claim, but was clearly a warning shot, a nudge toward a confrontation that Connor no longer wanted to handle face-to-face. Walter folded the letter neatly and placed it on the dining table. He didn't feel shaken, only confirmed. The move had come as expected, but the response it would draw from him would not be fear or panic. It would be the same as always, clarity, resolve, and unwavering boundaries. That afternoon, as the heat of the day began to break, Connor returned in person. This time he didn't pound on the door. He rang the bell, then waited. Walter opened the door and stood quietly, barring the entry with his body. "I guess you got the letter," Connor said, hands in his pockets, eyes shifting. "I did." Connor nodded, like he had rehearsed this conversation in his head. "Look, Dad, I'm not trying to sue you. It's just what you did, locking us out without any notice. That's not legal. I talked to someone, and technically, if I've lived here for more than a year, I have rights." Walter kept his expression neutral. "You lived here because I allowed it. I didn't charge rent. You didn't contribute to the mortgage, the taxes, the maintenance. You were a guest." Connor's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." "It is," Walter said. "You want to make it complicated because you don't want to admit what really happened." "And what's that?" Connor asked, voice rising. "That you treated your father like he was a burden, that you called him useless, that you lived under his roof while slowly resenting the very support you depended on." Connor's eyes flashed, but he didn't interrupt. Walter continued. "You want rights? Then act like someone who respects mine. You want space in this house? Then take responsibility. You don't get to insult me and expect the locks to stay the same." Connor exhaled hard and rubbed his forehead. "You always act like I'm the problem. Like you make it hard sometimes. You were never warm, Dad, never soft. You fixed things, but you didn't listen." Walter stepped back slightly, letting the words hit without defense. "Maybe that's true," he said. "I didn't always know how to be the kind of father you wanted. But I showed up. I stayed. I gave everything I had, and I never asked for anything in return." Connor looked away. "I was angry." "I know." Walter's voice softened, not with sentiment, but with gravity. "But anger can't be your excuse forever. You're a grown man. And now, you have to decide whether you want to rebuild something real or fight for a piece of something you didn't earn. A silence fell between them, long, taut, but not empty. Megan appeared behind Connor, walking slowly from the sidewalk. She wasn't dressed like someone passing through. She wore a modest blouse, jeans, and carried nothing but her purse. She approached, and Walter opened the door a little wider. "Can I come in?" she asked. Walter nodded. "Of course." Connor remained on the porch. Megan stepped inside, letting the screen door close gently behind her. Walter gestured to the kitchen, and they sat at the table, the law firm letter still resting beside the salt shaker. "I didn't know he was going to send that," Megan said quietly. "And when he did, I told him it was a mistake." Walter nodded once. "It doesn't surprise me." She folded her hands on the table. "He's not okay, Walter. He's flailing. He lost his job, and he doesn't know how to build anything anymore, especially not himself." "I can't rebuild him," Walter said. "He has to want that." "I know," she said, "but I wanted you to hear from me. I'm not standing behind him on this. I'm not going to fight a man who spent his life holding things together." Walter's eyes softened just a bit. "You're welcome here, Megan. Always." She gave him a small smile. "I appreciate that." They talked for a while longer, about nothing urgent, just steady conversation, like two people who shared years of family history, but finally found themselves speaking as equals. Walter could see the weight in her eyes, the stress of trying to keep peace between two men locked in a war neither of them wanted to escalate. She was tired, but not defeated. When she left, Walter walked her to the door. Connor was still on the porch, pacing. When he saw Megan come out, he straightened, as if expecting her to call him in. She didn't. She walked past him and opened the car door. "I'll see you later," she said to him. "Wait," Connor called out. "You're not going to stay?" "No," she replied calmly. "Not tonight." Connor's mouth opened to speak, but nothing came out. Megan got in and started the car. Walter stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed. "You can visit again," Walter said, "but you knock first, and you come in only if you're ready to be respectful." Connor stared at the floor. "What if I'm not ready yet?" "Then you stay on the porch." Walter didn't say it with cruelty, just truth. Connor nodded, stepped back, and walked his car. Walter watched as he drove off, slower this time, without the anger of the last departure. Back inside, the house was quiet again. Walter picked up the letter from the law firm and tore it cleanly in two. He dropped it into the trash without ceremony. That night, he sat in the living room, feet up, reading a book he hadn't touched in years. There were no outbursts, no drama, just a man, a book, and the knowledge that he had stood his ground. Not with fists or rage, but with boundaries that would no longer be ignored. The following week brought a change in rhythm. The tension that had settled over Walter's life like a dust-covered cloth was now lifting, revealing something sturdier beneath. Each morning, he woke with a quiet energy, no longer burdened by what might come knocking at the door. The boundaries had been drawn. The air inside the house felt different, not just lighter, but clearer, as if it now answered only to him. On Monday, Walter drove to the local community center, a low brick building nestled beside the public library. It was the kind of place he had driven past for years, assuming it had nothing to offer someone like him. But now, he stepped inside with a quiet sense of purpose. The air smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner. There was a large bulletin board near the front desk, filled with notices, printed schedules, and tear-away flyers. He signed up for a senior workshop on woodworking. He wrote his name in block letters on the form and noted his experience as a retired engineer. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 50s named Lorna, handed him a small welcome packet and told him about other groups he might like: the book club, the walking group, the history circle. "I'll start with one," Walter said with a smile. 2 days later, he returned with his toolbox in the trunk of his car and a pair of well-worn gloves in his back pocket. The woodworking room was modest. 6 long workbenches, scattered tools, and the rich scent of pine and cedar. There were 5 other men already there, all around his age, wearing flannel shirts and jeans, talking in the slow, easy cadence of men who had spent lifetimes solving practical problems with their hands. Introductions were brief but friendly. Harold had been a high school shop teacher. Dale used to run a furniture business. Jim, the oldest among them, claimed he just showed up for coffee. They welcomed Walter into the group like an old friend returning from a long trip. By the end of the first session, Walter was elbow deep in a birdhouse project, laughing at a shared story about table saw mishaps. His hands remembered the work, even if his shoulders complained a bit more than they used to. The room echoed with the sound of mallets and saws, of jokes and instructions. For the first time in years, Walter felt part of something that didn't revolve around obligation. He was there because he wanted to be. The next day, he visited the library next door. It had been decades since he held a library card, but within minutes he had a new one printed and tucked into his wallet. He signed up as a volunteer to assist with shelving and minor maintenance, tasks he found both simple and satisfying. On his way out, he picked up a book on architectural design and another on jazz history, two long-standing interests that had been buried beneath daily life for far too long. In the evenings, he worked on small carpentry projects in his garage. He refinished the top of the old patio table, repaired a broken bench, and began sketching plans for a new bookshelf to install in what was now becoming his reading room. He had already removed the spare bed and was in the process of painting the walls a soft, neutral gray. The room no longer resembled a space waiting for someone to return. It was now unmistakably his. He also reconnected with Michael, his old friend from work. They met for coffee at a small diner on the edge of town, where the booths were still lined with red vinyl, and the waitresses called everyone Han. Michael looked older, thinner than Walter remembered, but his laugh hadn't changed. They talked for hours about their careers, their families, and the strange way time reshaped everything. Michael was impressed by Walter's woodworking projects and invited him to bring something to the community showcase happening at the end of the month. "You've still got the hands," Michael said, clapping him on the shoulder. "And now you've got the time." Walter smiled. "Time's not the issue. It's what I do with it now that matters." On Friday evening, Walter returned home to find an envelope on the porch. There was no name on the outside, but he knew the handwriting. Inside was a note from Megan, written in neat, careful script. She thanked him for his grace, for giving her space to think, and for making it clear that respect was not optional. She wrote that Connor was still struggling, still angry, but quieter now, less explosive. She asked if Walter might consider sitting down with him again someday, not out of obligation, but when and if he felt ready. Walter read the letter twice, then placed it in the same drawer where he kept Connor's childhood drawings. He wasn't ready to respond, but he didn't throw it away. That night, the house buzzed gently with music. He had found an old stereo system in the attic and cleaned it, replaced the cables, and connected it to his collection of jazz records. As the sound of Miles Davis drifted through the house, Walter sat by the window with a book and a glass of iced tea, watching the streetlights blink on. There was still a silence in the house, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of peace. He didn't know if Connor would change. He didn't know if they would rebuild what had been lost. But that uncertainty no longer consumed him. The days were his now, and they were full, not just of tasks and errands, but of purpose. He had spent a lifetime being useful to others. Now, finally, he was being useful to himself. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Megan returned, this time alone without a call ahead, without Connor pacing outside or waiting in the car. Walter was in the backyard, trimming the hedges near the edge of the fence, his sleeves rolled up and sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. He saw her through the slats before she knocked, and for a moment he hesitated, pruning shears still in hand. The knock came gently, not demanding but tentative. Walter walked slowly around the front of the house, brushed his hands on his pants, and opened the door. "Megan," he said, not unkindly. "Hi, Walter," she replied, her voice soft but steady. They stood there for a beat, neither speaking, neither stepping forward. Then Walter opened the door wider and gestured her inside. They sat in the kitchen, the same place where so many awkward silences had once hung between them like fog. But today, something was different in her posture. She looked tired, yes, but also focused. There was no trace of the old hesitance, No nervous folding of napkins or glancing at the clock. "I needed to see you," Megan said, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea Walter had poured her. Without him, without the noise. Walter nodded slowly. "I understand." She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the neatness of the counters, the fresh flowers on the table, the small radio playing softly in the background. "It's peaceful here," she said. "It is now," Walter answered. He didn't mean it as a rebuke, just a statement of fact. Megan sighed. Connor struggling. "That's not new, and I'm not here to make excuses for him. But I also think you deserve to hear some things that haven't been said." Walter remained quiet, listening. When his father left, Connor was 13. Angry, confused. He buried it under ambition for a long time. Schoolwork, status. But that hole, he never filled it. And when life didn't turn out the way he imagined, when the career faltered, when the confidence slipped, he needed someone to blame. Walter's eyes remained on her. "So he picked me because you stayed," she said. "Because you were there." And somewhere along the way, his resentment twisted into the story he told himself, that you were cold, distant, that everything you did came with expectations, that you were measuring him. Walter leaned back slightly. "I wasn't measuring him. I was waiting for him to stand up on his own." Megan nodded. "I believe that. But he doesn't. Not yet. Right now, he's unraveling. The law firm letter? That wasn't about property. That was a tantrum dressed in paperwork. He wanted to scare you into backing down." Walter gave a short breath of dry humor. "Didn't work." "I told him it wouldn't," Megan said. "That's why I'm here." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, placing it on the table between them. "This is his. A journal. I found it in a drawer a few nights ago. I shouldn't have read it, but I did, and there are pages in there that you need to see." Walter didn't touch the book. "I'm not interested in apologies," he won't say out loud. "This isn't about apologies," she said. "It's about truth, even if it's messy, even if he's not ready to hand it to you himself." Still, Walter hesitated. Megan pressed gently. "You've always been stronger than him. That strength, it casts shadows. He lives in one, whether he admits it or not. But part of him, deep down, still wants to step out of it. He's just never learned how." They sat in silence again. The sound of birdsong came faintly from outside. Walter looked at the notebook. It was black, leather-bound, with a red ribbon marking the last page. He reached out slowly, lifted it, and turned it over in his hands without opening it. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," he said. "Read it," Megan replied. "Then decide." She stood up, finishing her tea in one quiet sip. "I'm staying with a friend for now, just giving things space. I needed to come here today to tell you that you're not alone in this, that you didn't imagine it. The disrespect, the pain, it was real, but so is the part of Connor that still remembers who you were to him." Walter stood as well, walking her to the door. "Thank you for coming, Megan." She looked up at him, a softness in her eyes. "You deserve more than silence at that table." After she left, Walter returned to the kitchen and placed a notebook on the table. He stared at it for a long while before standing again and walking into his newly transformed reading room. He sat in the leather chair near the window, let the afternoon light wash over him, and opened the book. He didn't skip around. He read from the beginning, page by page. It wasn't polished writing. It was raw, disorganized, half-thoughts scribbled late at night, sketches of dreams, fragments of anger, flashes of regret. There were rants about failure, about pressure, about never feeling good enough. But there were also memories, flashes of admiration, even moments of longing. One entry described a summer trip to a cabin in Michigan. Connor had written, "Dad spent 2 hours teaching me how to start a fire with just dry sticks. I thought he was showing off. But really, he was showing me how to rely on myself. I didn't get it then. I think I'm only just starting to." Another page, written after Megan had left the house, simply read, "I don't want to be this version of me anymore." Walter closed the book gently. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just sat there for a long time, The room silent except for the occasional creak of the house settling. He placed a notebook on the side table, stood, and walked to the garage. He needed to keep his hands moving. That evening, he sanded a new piece of oak for a bookshelf he was building. He measured, marked, and worked slowly, the way he had taught Connor to do when he was a boy. The door to reconciliation wasn't open yet, but something had shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but the understanding that before anything could be rebuilt, the foundation had to be exposed, even if it meant peeling back years of silence and pain. And Walter, with his steady hands and patient eyes, knew all about building from the ground up. Walter found the small box quite by accident while moving some of his woodworking tools around in the garage. It was tucked behind an old cabinet, dusty and forgotten, its faded edges hinting at years of neglect. He pulled it out carefully and wiped the surface with his sleeve before prying it open. Inside were dozens of notebooks, some leather-bound, others just spiral pads, filled with his handwriting, jumbled thoughts, ideas, plans, and dreams he had long abandoned. He sat down on the bench beside the work table and picked up the top journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. The ink was faded in places, but his handwriting was unmistakable, careful, deliberate, filled with hope. The first entry was dated back to his 40s, a time when the house had been filled with laughter, and life seemed full of promise. Walter began to read. The pages unfolded like a window into a man whose dreams had been pushed aside, not out of choice but necessity. Travel plans to see the national parks, a list of books he wanted to read, ideas for inventions inspired by his engineering work, and even sketches for a small, portable wind turbine he had once hoped to build. One page caught his eye, a carefully written note titled Music Dreams. It described his long ago wish to learn the saxophone, to play jazz in small clubs, and to fill quiet nights with sound. He smiled faintly, remembering how those dreams had been swallowed by bills, family needs, and the daily grind. As he flipped through the pages, Walter found entries about his hopes for Connor and the family, notes on how he wanted to be a better father, how he struggled to balance work and home life, and confessions of his own fears, of failure, of being invisible, of growing old alone. The realization settled over him. He had given so much of himself away, layer by layer, until there was little left to show for the man he once was. Not because anyone had taken it, but because he had never taken it for himself. He set the journal down gently and reached for another. This one was a collection of technical sketches, inventions, and half-finished plans. It was a testament to a lifetime of innovation. Bridges designed, systems improved, machines imagined. Yet many pages ended abruptly, the thoughts unfinished, dreams deferred. Walter sat in the garage for hours, reading, remembering, and quietly mourning the time lost. But amid the sadness, a new feeling emerged, a determination. If he could dream once, he could dream again. He reached for a clean notebook and pen and began writing, not technical schematics, but a plan for the future he still wanted, for the man he still could be. It included small steps: finishing the bookshelf, joining the woodworking group, signing up for music lessons, even looking into travel possibilities. It was a beginning. The next morning, Walter called the local community college. The voice on the other end was warm and helpful, guiding him to adult education courses. He signed up for a beginner saxophone class, starting the following week. After the call, he went to his toolbox and pulled out his old engineering calculator, dusted it off, and smiled. The tools he needed were still here. His hands still knew their work. That afternoon, as he worked on the patio table, he thought about his relationship with Connor. Maybe the man his son resented was a man who had given up parts of himself to provide. Maybe his son had never seen the full picture, never known the dreams that had been shelved to keep the family afloat. Walter decided it was time to build not only furniture, but also bridges. Bridges between himself and his past, and between himself and the son he hoped to reconnect with. The house felt alive again, not because of the absence of others, but because of the presence of new purpose. He looked out the window and thought of the paths ahead. Not easy, not without challenges, but his own to walk. And for the first time in many years, Walter Green felt like he was truly beginning to live again. It was early Saturday afternoon when Connor showed up again at the front door, this time without Megan's company, and without the usual frustration seeping from his voice. Walter was in the garage, finishing the sanding of a small wooden chair he had been restoring. When he heard the bell, he wiped his hands on a rag and made his way inside. At the door stood Connor, his posture calmer than before, though his eyes still held the same guarded tension. Walter opened the door wider than usual, signaling an invitation. For the first time since the lunch table incident, Walter offered his son coffee, not out of obligation, but as a gesture of cautious goodwill. "Sit down," Walter said quietly. "Let's talk." Connor stepped inside, his footsteps hesitant but steady. They moved into the kitchen where a fresh pot of coffee steamed on the stove. Walter poured 2 mugs, handing one over with a steady hand. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken history and hurt. Connor finally took a sip, eyes fixed on the worn countertop. "I didn't know how to say it before," Connor began, voice low. "I was angry, but I didn't understand what I was angry about. You were always there, fixing things, paying bills, keeping the house going. But I never felt like I belonged, like I was living in your shadow." Walter listened, not interrupting. "I called you useless," Connor admitted, swallowing hard. "That was cruel. I was frustrated with myself, with the life I thought I'd have. I didn't know how to tell you that I was scared." Walter's gaze softened. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to carry my approval to be worthy. I wanted you to build your own life, one you could be proud of." Connor nodded, his eyes wet. "I think I'm ready to try, to be part of this house again, but only if it's different, if there's respect." Walter set his mug down firmly. "Respect isn't just about words, Connor. It's about actions, responsibility, and boundaries." Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I understand. I want to prove it. I'm not asking for a free pass. I'm ready to be accountable." Walter's expression was serious. "Good, because if respect can't be met, then this house will no longer be your refuge." Connor nodded, a mix of relief and resolve washing over his features. They talked for hours about expectations, boundaries, and the painful truths they had both avoided for years. Walter shared his need for honesty and effort, while Connor admitted his fears of failure and inadequacy. Megan was mentioned, too, how she struggled to hold their fractured family together. At one point, Connor reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Walter. "It's a letter," Connor said quietly. "I wasn't sure if I'd give it to you, but I think you deserve to hear everything." Walter unfolded the paper carefully and began to read. The letter was a mix of apology and confession, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had spent years hiding behind anger and silence. Connor acknowledged his mistakes, the weight of his bitterness, and his desire for a fresh start. He didn't ask for forgiveness outright, but hoped for understanding. When he finished, Walter folded the letter and placed it on the table. He looked up at Connor, his eyes steady and warm. "This is a start," Walter said, "but it's what comes next that matters." Connor smiled faintly. "I'm ready." Walter stood and extended his hand. Connor shook it firmly, a gesture not just of reconciliation, but of new beginnings. Later that evening, Walter sat by the window, the letter folded beside his armchair. Outside, the stars blanketed the night sky, vast and infinite. He thought about the long road ahead, the work it would take to rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time, there was hope, not in grand gestures or promises, but in the quiet commitment of 2 men ready to meet halfway. The house, once filled with silence and tension, began to feel a little less empty. Walter closed his eyes, breathing in the night air. Tomorrow would be different. The morning light seeped softly through the kitchen window, casting long, golden shadows across the hardwood floor. Walter awoke early as usual, his body still adjusting to the rhythms of a quieter home. There was a serenity in the house now, a cautious peace that hadn't existed in years. He stretched, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and dressed in his usual comfortable clothes. Breakfast was a simple affair, black coffee and toast, consumed in silence, but the calm was different from before. It carried an undercurrent of anticipation. As Walter cleared the kitchen table, his eyes caught something that hadn't been there the night before. A folded envelope lay in the center, pristine and deliberate. No handwriting on the front, no indication of the sender. His heart beat a little faster, curiosity mingling with caution. He reached for it carefully, the paper cool and smooth beneath his fingers. Walter unfolded the letter slowly, smoothing the creases as he began to read. The handwriting was unmistakable. Connor's neat, deliberate script, a marked contrast to the rushed, angry words he'd thrown across the lunch table days ago. The letter began with an apology, deep, genuine, and weighted by years of regret. Connor acknowledged the pain he had caused, not just with his words, but with his absence, his bitterness, and the walls he had built between them. He confessed that anger had often been a mask for insecurity and disappointment, and that he had failed to express the gratitude Walter deserved. Walter read through passages describing the years of struggle Connor had faced, the job losses, the pressure of living up to expectations, and the loneliness that came with it. But woven through the confessions were threads of hope. Connor wrote of wanting to rebuild their relationship, to earn his father's respect, and to contribute in a way that felt authentic. He promised to come back into the house not as a dependent or an entitled heir, but as a man willing to take responsibility for his place in the family and home. The letter was not long, but every word carried weight. Walter read it twice, the first time quietly absorbing, the second time feeling the shift within himself. There was no rush to respond, no immediate need for action, just the simple act of being seen. For the first time in many years, Walter felt the heavy fog of resentment begin to lift. He placed the letter carefully on the table and rose to open the window. The morning air was crisp and fresh, filled with the scent of dew and distant pine. He breathed deeply, letting the new day wash over him. Later that morning, Walter called Megan. The conversation was brief but warm. She told him Connor was nervous but committed to visiting soon. Walter accepted the news with quiet hope, understanding that the process of healing would be slow and steady. In the days that followed, Walter prepared the house, not for a grand reunion, but for small moments of connection. He cleaned the guest room, placing fresh linens on the bed and a small vase of flowers on a nightstand. He made sure the kitchen was stocked with Connor's favorite coffee and snacks. Each task was a gesture of readiness, a silent message that the door was open when respect was shown. When Connor finally arrived, it was neither dramatic nor fraught with tension. He stepped through the door with cautious steps, carrying a small duffel bag and a tentative smile. The two men exchanged a nod, a simple greeting loaded with unspoken emotion. They sat together at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and conversation. It was awkward at times, but real. They spoke not as adversaries, but as father and son trying to rediscover each other. Over the next weeks, their visits became more frequent. Conversations grew longer, laughter began to return, and the house gradually felt more like a home again, not because of perfection, but because of presence. Walter knew the road ahead would have bumps and setbacks, but he also knew that this letter on the table was more than paper. It was a bridge, a fragile, hopeful bridge. And for now, that was enough. The first visit after the letter had opened a door not just in the house, but in their lives. Connor's return was tentative, cautious, a man feeling his way back into a place that had been both refuge and battleground. Yet, over the following weeks, that tentative return began to evolve into something more tangible, more real. Connor arrived once a week, usually on Sunday afternoons. He would bring a small bag with some clothes, a laptop, and a box of groceries. They didn't rush. The conversation started with the weather, the state of the lawn, the occasional comment about a book Walter was reading. Slowly, the walls they had built over years began to crack. Walter noticed how Connor moved differently around the house, not like an intruder, but like someone rediscovering a place he had always belonged to. He helped with chores around the kitchen, washed dishes without being asked, and offered to mow the lawn on some weekends. It was the first time Walter had felt an active partnership in the household, rather than the lonely burden of sole responsibility. One afternoon, while Walter was in the garage working on a small wooden bench, Connor walked in with a piece of scrap wood in his hands. He held it awkwardly, unsure. "I thought maybe I could help," he said, voice low. Walter looked up and smiled. "I could use a hand." They worked side by side, sanding, measuring, and piecing together the rough parts. There were moments of silence and moments filled with shared jokes about botched measurements and splinters. Walter could feel the years of distance folding into the present, subtle but undeniable. At night, the house was quieter, not in the hollow way it had been when Connor was gone, but in a way that spoke of presence and respect. Walter still kept the locks changed, and the front door was always locked when he went to bed, but Connor had been given a key, a symbol more than a tool. Their conversations deepened beyond the superficial. They spoke about their fears and failures, their hopes and regrets. Walter shared stories from his engineering days, anecdotes of triumphs and missteps. Connor spoke of his struggles with identity and purpose, the weight of expectations he had carried for decades. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Connor suggested they take a walk around the neighborhood. Walter agreed, and they set off together, side by side, moving slowly but steadily. The familiar streets no longer felt like barriers, but paths leading somewhere new. Along the way, they passed a local community center, where Walter had begun his woodworking classes. Connor stopped and looked at the flyer pinned to the bulletin board, highlighting an upcoming community showcase for crafts and projects. "You thinking of entering?" Connor asked with a faint smile. Walter chuckled. "Maybe. I'm working on a bookshelf." Connor nodded. "I might help you build it." They continued walking, the conversation flowing naturally, free from the tension of the past. Back at the house, Walter continued to renovate the spare room into his reading nook and workshop. Connor helped paint walls and assemble shelves, the room transforming into a shared space for quiet reflection and creation. On weekends, they sometimes cooked meals together, trying new recipes, and occasionally making mistakes that ended in laughter rather than frustration. Megan's absence was still felt, but Walter understood that healing was a process for all of them. Walter noticed subtle changes in himself, too. His steps felt lighter, his smile more frequent. The years of quiet service and sacrifice were no longer a burden, but a foundation. He was no longer just a father or a caretaker, but a man reclaiming his life with the son who was beginning to meet him halfway. One afternoon, Walter sat in his favorite chair by the window, a book in hand. Connor was nearby, assembling a small birdhouse for the garden. The house no longer felt like a battleground or a place of silence. It was a home, imperfect, still healing, but As the weeks passed, Walter understood that respect was not given lightly and could not be demanded. It was earned through effort, understanding, and shared moments. He wasn't naive to believe everything was fixed, but the door was open now. Quietly, steadily, without fanfare, they were building again, not just furniture or rooms, but trust. And in that, Walter found something he hadn't felt in years: hope. A year had passed since the day Walter first changed the locks. The house that once felt like a battleground between a father and son now breathed with the quiet pulse of a home being reborn. It stood not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol of transformation, a testament to patience, resilience, and the power of second chances. The morning sun poured through the windows of the newly repainted guest room, now fully converted into Walter's reading nook. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books ranging from architectural blueprints to jazz history and classic literature. A comfortable leather armchair sat in the corner, accompanied by a soft woolen throw and a small side table where a brass reading lamp cast a warm glow. This was Walter's sanctuary, a space he had carved out for himself after years of putting others first. Across the hall, the garage had been transformed into a proper woodshop. Tools hung in neat rows on pegboards. Workbenches were clear and sturdy, and the air smelled of fresh pine and varnish. Walter had spent countless hours here, shaping wood into practical objects and pieces of art. And now, he no longer worked alone. Connor had become an enthusiastic partner in many of these projects. He had developed a newfound appreciation for craft, his earlier anger replaced with curiosity and a desire to learn. The awkwardness that had once marked their interactions had melted away into laughter and shared accomplishment. One Saturday afternoon, Walter and Connor stood side by side, assembling a large bookshelf for the living room. Connor held the plank steady while Walter measured and drilled. Their conversation flowed easily. "I never thought I'd enjoy this," Connor admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But there's something about building something with your hands. It feels good." Walter smiled. It's the same feeling I had when I was your age. Building bridges, solving problems, making things that last. It's about creating order in chaos. Connor nodded. I guess I've been trying to build my life without a blueprint. No wonder it felt impossible. Walter paused, tightening a screw. Sometimes we have to tear down what doesn't work before we can start fresh. They worked late into the afternoon, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows through garage windows. When the bookshelf was finally upright, sturdy and perfect, Connor clapped Walter on the back. You did good, Dad. Walter chuckled. We did good. Later that evening, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. Megan was there, her present a bridge between past tensions and new beginnings. The table was set with simple but delicious food, roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and freshly baked bread. The conversation was light but sincere, filled with stories and gentle teasing. The atmosphere was warm, the kind that comes from healing wounds and building trust. After dinner, Walter showed Megan and Connor the reading nook. Megan ran her hand along the spines of books, a smile spreading across her face. It's beautiful, she said. You've created a real home here. Walter looked around and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This house was no longer just a place where he lived. It was a reflection of who he was and who he had become. The walls held not just memories, but promises of a future forged with care and respect. That night, as Walter sat in his favorite chair, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The insult at the lunch table, the silent decision to change the locks, the painful conversations, and slow rebuilding. It had all led to this moment of peace. He reached for his journal, the one he had found in the garage months ago. On the last page, he wrote, Strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go. Respect is earned, trust rebuilt, and love rekindled. This house is no longer just mine. It belongs to those willing to build something real. Walter set the pen down and looked out the window. The stars were beginning to emerge, twinkling like distant promises in the vast sky. He smiled, knowing that while the journey was far from over, he was no longer walking it alone. He was finally living,